So it is my privilege, without further ado, to introduce Professor Lennox to you. Professor John Lennox is Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. He's a Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science. He also teaches for the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program. He's lectured extensively in North America, Eastern and Western Europe and Australasia on mathematics, the philosophy of science and the intellectual defence of Christianity. He also speaks a number of languages. He has written numerous books on the interface between science, philosophy and theology, and here's just 3 of them, which I commend to you. God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Gunning for God on the New Atheism, which I highly, highly recommend. It's just a fantastic book. And 7 Days that Divide the World, which addresses the early chapters of the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Professor Lennox has published 70 mathematical papers and has also co-authored 2 research-level texts in algebra. Any algebra fans out there this evening? Wonderful. Okay, not sure if you're telling the truth there or not. Professor Lennox has debated Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Peter Singer, of course, from here in Australia. John is married to Sally, who's been travelling with him on this very exhausting trip. He has 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and in his spare time is an amateur astronomer and an avid bird watcher. So would you welcome Professor Lennox as he comes to address us this evening?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your warm welcome. You can see immediately I've arranged the weather to be abnormal so that you would come tonight. But this is my first time in this part of Australia, and it's always a pleasure to meet new people and to be enormously encouraged that you would take the time to come on a Saturday evening to think about this massive topic. Now, behind me on the screen is my friend John Dixon, and I would encourage you to come and listen to him. I straddle the humanities and the sciences, more towards the sciences. He is a historian of great expertise, and one of the very important aspects of the evidences for the truth of Christianity is historical. And I would really encourage you to come along and hear John, because he will be giving you all kinds of ideas on how to speak into the current situation from the perspective of an ancient historian. But our title tonight is Science and God. And I rather like the way that the title has been put, because it shows us we're not dealing with 2 equally categorizable things. God is the personal God who created and sustains the universe. Science, on the other hand, is a set of intellectual disciplines that are geared to investigating the natural world. So they do not belong to the same category. I say that because one of the great confusions, and I shall be dealing with several tonight, is that science and God are equal and opposite ways of trying to explain the universe. I shall point out that that is completely false. But of course, lying behind our title is the sense that so many people have in our contemporary world that science has rendered belief in God both unnecessary and false, and has finally put an end to any notion that you can be intellectually respectable and believe in a creator. That's clearly false. And it's also clearly false that the warfare even lies at that level. The easiest way to illustrate that is by last year's Nobel Prize for Physics, which was won by Peter Higgs, a Scotsman who's an atheist. A few years ago, it was won by William Phillips, an American who's a Christian. And the obvious thing to deduce from that is that they are not divided by their physics. They've each won the Nobel Prize. You can't do any better than that. So what does divide them? What divides them is their worldview. Atheism and theism, in Philip's case, and in mine, Christianity. So the real situation out there is that there is a conflict. It's not between science and God, as I shall establish or try to. It's between two worldviews that are very ancient. The ancient Greeks had brilliant people like Leucippus and Democritus. And they thought about reality, and they decided that ultimate reality consisted of two things: atoms and empty space, as we would now call it. The void, they called it. And as the atoms cascaded through empty space, they coalesced to form galaxies and worlds and stars and planets. And in the end, they produced life and the mind. They were the forerunners of our contemporary materialists. And their worldview was popularized by a brilliant Latin poem, De Rerum Natura, by Lucretius, the Epicurean poet, which is very well worthwhile reading in a translation if you have to. So that was one side of it. At the same time in ancient Greece, there were people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And they believed that this universe was not all that exists. There was transcendence, there were the gods, there was God. And so barreling up through history into the Western Academy are those two worldviews, very powerfully represented in each direction, my own University of Oxford. Naturalism, the idea that nature is all that exists. It's intimately related to materialism. And its opposite, and that is theism, and in my case, Christianity. That's where the conflict lies. So the real question is not God and science or God or science. The real question is this: what way does science point? Does it point towards atheism or does it point towards theism? Now, my axiom in all of this, since I am a convinced Christian, is that God makes it evident which way nature points. There is evidence in nature. From the very beginning of creation, the senior apostle Paul pointed out in his famous theological statement to the Christians at Rome, that in the things that from the very beginning, in the things that are made, God is to be perceived, namely his Godhead and his power. And he says that this evidence is so powerful that human beings are without excuse. Now that's an immensely strong statement. What Paul is claiming is God has left his fingerprints, his signature in the universe. It isn't neutral. And that you can perceive that there is a God and that he's powerful. Please notice the limitation, though. You can't perceive the doctrine of the atonement, for instance, in nature, but you can perceive that there is a God and that he is powerful. Now, I'm a mathematician, and you notice my emphasis on the word perceive. I did not, and neither did Paul, use the word prove for a very good reason. Because he knew, as well as any mathematician knows in the 21st century, that proof has two meanings. It has a very rigorous meaning in my own field of pure mathematics. That a proof is, well, it starts with a series of axioms and proceeds by accepted rules of logic to a secure conclusion on the basis of those axioms. You do not get that kind of proof in any other intellectual discipline, not in physics, not in chemistry, and not in ordinary life. So the problem is that when people ask, prove it to me, I've first of all got to say, what do you mean by proof? Because, well, I can't prove to you that my wife of 46 years marriage loves me. I can't prove that mathematically. But that doesn't mean it is uncertain. I'd stake my life on it. I cannot prove to you mathematically that the aircraft which is supposed to be taking me from Sydney to Vancouver on Tuesday will get me there. But I'll have to stake my life on it. So don't get the impression that because we don't have mathematical proof of these matters, we can't have what the lawyers call proof beyond reasonable doubt that you can stake your life on. So I want to give you some evidence, a sequence of evidences. First of all, from history, the history of science. Secondly, from the nature of science. And depending on what time we've got, from the results of science. I'm not going to do it the opposite way round. It is very common in lectures like this to start with some scientific entity and argue that God must have made this. I'm not going to do that because I think those are the arguments that only make sense after we've discussed a lot of preliminary things about the history and the nature and philosophy of science. The history of science is important, hence my reference to John Dickson, because in my field, history is enormously important. If you just think of the history, intellectually history of Europe, the famous historian of science, Sir Alfred North Whitehead, said that Europe in 1500 knew less than Archimedes, who died in 212 BC. Knew less than Archimedes. They'd lost a lot. And yet by 1700, 200 years later, Newton's Principia Mathematica had been written. And in answering the question, how did that happen? How was there such an explosion of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, between 1500 and 1700? Alfred North Whitehead was under no illusion. He says it must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. In other words, he connected faith in God with the rise of science. Now that's astonishing for many people in the contemporary world. I remember the first time I gave a lecture in Akademgorodok in Novosibirsk in Siberia, the first ever lecture on these topics in 75 years. And while I was lecturing, I could see a lot of angry professors in the front row, and I don't like angry professors. So I stopped and I said, what's the matter? I'd just been telling them that Galileo and Kepler and Newton and Clerk Maxwell and Babbage and so on were believers in God. And they stopped me and I said, what's the matter? They said, we've never heard this before. Why has nobody ever told us? I said, can't you guess? It had been suppressed. Because the connection between the rise of modern science, I'm not talking about the transmission by the Islamic philosophers of Aristotle and so on to Europe. I'm talking about the rise of modern science. It has been suppressed. I meet many people in the West today who have no idea that it was faith in God that drove the rise in science. Far from belief in God hindering it, it was the motor that drove it. And that leads us to a very curious situation. What has happened since 1700 to change the picture completely? So that Newton believes in God, and Hawking, who held Newton's chair, says you've got to choose between God and science. You can't have both, and there is no God anyway. And I want to analyze that because as we do the historical trail as to what has happened and raise the questions, I hope you will begin to see what it is that's going on at the heart of this debate. But let's leave that with a quote from C.S. Lewis, whom I'm old enough to have listened to in lectures at Cambridge many years ago, and who's had such an influence on my own intellectual development. C.S. Lewis said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, Richard Dawkins took me up on that in public, and he said, but everybody believed in God then. That's no great deal. Well, of course, Richard Dawkins, everybody, forgot China, which is not an insubstantial part of the world, even then. Because you see, the Chinese, although they developed a lot of brilliant technology, they never developed abstract science. And that posed a question for many historians and philosophers, notably for Joseph Needham of Cambridge, who was a brilliant chemist and also a sinologist, an expert on Chinese and China, and who wrote the definitive history of science and technology in China. He was a neo-Marxist, and for many years he tried to explain why the Chinese lacked abstract science and the West had it on the basis of neo-Marxist atheist principles, and he couldn't. And in the end he admitted that the only difference he could see between the East and the West was that the East lacked the unifying concept of a single creator. That's a very interesting thing. So there it comes from the other direction as well. Witness from history that the advance of science and belief in God are very intimately connected. Now, you have a very distinguished ancient historian in Australia, Edwin Judge, and he's written on these matters. And I can recommend very thoroughly what he has to say. So my first point, and I'm going to put it very bluntly, is this: I'm not remotely embarrassed at being both a Christian and a scientist. Richard Dawkins suggests I should be very embarrassed, but I'm not remotely embarrassed, because Christianity arguably gave me my subject, historically. So that's the first thing. Well, why then the pressure from Hawking and Dawkins and so on to choose between science and God? I think it is to do with fog, intellectual fog, and confusion that has been generated by lack of precise consideration of what we're talking about. The first confusion, which may surprise some of you, is the widespread confusion about the nature of God. We're talking about God and science. So let's think about God for a moment. God is a delusion, according to the famous book by that name. And it is almost amusing, although sad to me, to be constantly accused of believing in a God who fits in the same category as Santa Claus. I was in the Netherlands a few weeks ago, and in 2 different universities to packed audiences like this, I had 2 senior professors accuse me of this quite independently, that my God was like Santa Claus. So I put it to the audience. I said, ladies and gentlemen, let's test this. How many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult? Well, how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult? How many of you came to believe in God as an adult? Do you see the difference, ladies and gentlemen? To put God in the same category as Santa Claus is naive and really very silly. We need to get rid of this kind of triviality of argument. Of course, there is a history behind this, and a quasi-scientific one. It's all to do with Sigmund Freud. Santa Claus is a nice old character. In fact, I've been confused with Santa Claus. I ought to tell you that story because I used to be in the University of Wales, and students were asked why they came to the university, and one girl said, well, she looked at all the prospectuses of mathematics departments, and she'd seen a photograph of a seminar, and there in the middle of it was somebody teaching the students who looked just like Santa Claus. It was me. So anyway, the Freudian attack. And I've met it several times in my time in Australia. The idea that you believe in God, it's a delusion really, but the motivation for it is obvious. That you need some kind of projected father figure in the sky. Your experience of a father mightn't have been very good anyway. And you want some kind of comfort that's projected outside this world into an imaginary heaven after death. Well, it is a brilliant explanation if there is no God. But as Manfred Lutz, one of Germany's most distinguished psychiatrists, has pointed out in a recent best-selling book, very interesting book, he points out, yes, if there is no God, Freud gives you a wonderful explanation of religion as wish fulfillment. Of course, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you how atheism is a wish fulfillment. As Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel laureate in Poland for literature, said, atheism is the great opium of the people. The desire not ever to have to meet God and give account for our lusts and our desires and our murders. The Freudian argument, like many arguments, works both ways. And the trouble is we only hear it on one side. And Manfred Lutz, being the honest psychiatrist he is, says, if there is a God, Freud explains religion as wish fulfillment. If there's no God. If there is a God, Freud explains atheism as wish fulfillment. But on the question whether there's a God or not, Freud, Jung, or Frankl, none of them can help you. You'll have to look elsewhere. And so you get this trivial kind of thing that Stephen Hawking came out with in the UK not long ago. He was asked about religion, how he would sum it up. Well, he said, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And I was asked to comment. So I said, okay, you can write this. Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. The fact that you clapped shows you didn't understand my argument. I pointed out that such statements mean nothing. It works both ways. We have to look for evidence elsewhere. But it was nice of you to clap anyway. So this idea of God being a psychologized or psychiatric projection just doesn't work. But now, more seriously, although that particular fog at the beginning stops many people from thinking straight about God, the more serious thing is that there is an increasing habit of some of our public intellectuals, so-called, to demote the God of the Bible to an ancient Greek God. I was debating a group of atheists with some colleagues. One of them was Peter Hitchens, the brother of the late Christopher, in Oxford recently, and I was accused of atheism. I get accused of atheism quite a great deal. But atheism in the sense that I am an atheist with respect to Wotan, Zeus, Artemis, Baal, and so on, which I confess, ladies and gentlemen, in case you don't realize it, I am an Azucist of the most convinced kind. So, with a great smile, Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptic magazine, whom I debated twice in Sydney a few years back, said, and we just go one God more. We get rid of the God of the Bible, with a great smile of triumph. And I thought, goodness me, he knows nothing about the ancient Near East and its gods. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, to put the God of the Bible in the same box as the God of thunder, or the God of sex, or the God of war, is to commit an utterly fundamental mistake. Werner Jaeger, a world authority on the ancient Greek gods, puts it this way. All of the gods of the ancient pantheons, Greek, Roman, Babylonian, Assyrian, and so on, they are all descended from the heavens and the earth. I don't know whether you realize it, but all of those gods were products of some kind of primeval chaos or soup. That idea is very old. The God of the Bible, he says, on the other hand, created the heavens and the earth. That's a vast difference. And again, putting God in that category leads you to a huge error. And it's right on the margins of our contemporary debate. It leads Stephen Hawking to force you to choose between God and science. Let me put it this way. The logic of it is simple, but it's extremely important. You see, those ancient gods, many of them, were gods of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Lightning and thunder were frightening. It must be a God talking. But if you do atmospheric physics at the University of Queensland, that God will disappear in one lecture. Gone. And how is that God removed? By doing some science. You now no longer need to deify lightning. You de-deify it by introducing a scientific explanation. And that's perfectly sensible. So what has happened is this, that many people, including Hawking clearly, think that I believe in such a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now follow me here, because this is the important logical step. If you define God to be a God of the gaps, a placeholder, an X that holds the fort until science comes and fills the gap with an explanation, of course you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. Have you got that? That is a very important thing. It took me a very long time to realize what was going on, that why these people felt such pressure. Why can't you see you have to choose between God and science? Their confusion was to do with the nature of God, because their God is a God of the gaps, and that's the God they think I and my fellow Christians believe in. But I don't. I don't believe in a God of the things I don't understand. I believe in a God of the things I do understand, and a God of the things I don't understand. In other words, I believe in a God of the whole show. And you see, if you have that view, that God is the creator of the universe, there would be no universe for physics to be done in if there wasn't a God who caused it to be and who sustains it. Then you see, you can happily take the view of Newton. When he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, well, I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. What did he do? He wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, expressing in it the explicit hope that it would cause a thinking person to believe in a deity. In other words, the more he understood of how it worked, the more he believed in the genius of the God who did it that way, not the less. And of course that parallels our uniform experience. The more you know of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls Royce, not the less. So it amazes me that people have got into this confusion, but I can understand it, because there's another thing, and now it's a fog in science. There are fogs about the nature of God, but there are fogs in science. Confusion about the nature of explanation. Now, the word explanation may seem a very simple concept to us, but I would suggest to you that it's confusion about the nature of explanation at its various levels that leads to this continuous, constant misapprehension of this as a war between God and science. So let's talk a little bit about scientific explanation. The worst form, the worst deviation really from reality is the current fad for scientism, that science is the only way to truth. And Hawking in his book, The Grand Design, more or less says so. Philosophy is dead, he says, which is a very odd thing to say when you're just about to write a book on the topic. But that's another matter. And then he says it's left for scientists to hold the torch of truth, echoing what Bertrand Russell once said, although he didn't believe in scientism, but he put it brilliantly: what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Now, I have christened scientism scientific fundamentalism, because that focuses the mind a little more. And George Ellis, a famous cosmologist, says, fundamentalism is what happens when a partial truth is proclaimed as the whole truth. Only one viewpoint is allowed, all others are false. And that echoes the various fundamentalisms we have around the world. But actually, it's logically incoherent, because Russell's statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, is not a statement of science. And therefore, you cannot know it if it's true. So if it's true, it's false. It's too late for logic, isn't it, on a Saturday night? But there we are. What can I do? You'll have to have a look at my book. Secondly, what does it mean to say that science explains? I've mentioned the law of gravity. Hawking mentions it, and we're going to come to it in a moment. But what does the law of gravity explain? Do you know what it doesn't explain? Gravity. Nobody knows what gravity is. I wish I'd been taught that at school, or even at university, because I used to think the law of gravity told me what gravity is. It doesn't. No one knows what gravity is. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Wittgenstein, who was a very sharp thinker, said the great deception of modernism is the idea that the laws of nature explain the world to us when all they do is describe structural regularities. Now that's devastating because you see, I'm not talking about God here. I'm talking about the concept of scientific explanation. And I'm talking against a background where people say, oh, we've got a scientific explanation. What does that mean? Does it mean you got the full explanation? Almost certainly not. In every case, including in science. I'm passionate about science, but I'm passionate against its abuse and misuse. The law of gravity is brilliant. I love it. 8 symbols. Mathematics, of course, is the language of compression, getting things expressed in the least symbols possible. And from that 8-symbol equation, you can deduce the elliptical orbits of the planet around the sun. You can land a person on the moon without even knowing about Einstein's corrections. It's genius beyond. Doesn't tell you what gravity is. Now the interesting thing is Newton knew that and said so. He didn't proclaim non fingo hypotheses. He said, I don't make hypotheses. In other words, I'm not telling you what gravity is, but I'm giving you a brilliant tool to calculate the way things work. So that's the first thing. Now the next thing. I think the main problem on the first side is confusion about the nature of God. The main problem on the scientific side is confusion about the nature and the different levels of explanation. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, the heat energy from the Bunsen flame is being conducted through the copper base of the kettle, and that is agitating the molecules of water to such an extent they've got so excited they've started to fly off the surface of the water. Build up pressure, and a little whistle is starting to go. That's why it's boiling. Nonsense. It's boiling because I would like a cup of tea as soon as possible. Well, I'm glad you laugh, ladies and gentlemen. Would you ever dream of saying something like that? That the scientific explanation contradicts the personal agent explanation. And there's the kettle boiling. And in order to give some sense of completeness to your explanation, you've got to have 2 kinds of explanation. The one in terms of the science, and the other in terms of the intentions and desires of a personal agent. I find school kids can usually see this much better than some of my professorial colleagues. Who would ever think of offering as alternatives for a motor car engine, on the one hand, the law of internal combustion and automobile engineering, and on the other hand, Henry Ford? Please choose. That's what Hawking's doing. He's really asking you, you've got to choose between Henry Ford, who doesn't exist anyway, and the law of internal combustion. That's exactly what he's doing, an exact parallel to it. It's idiotic when you think about it in that way, isn't it? You see, we study in science the way the universe works and what it's made of. None of those arguments say anything to contradict the notion that there's a creator who invented it in the first place so that it would be there when we started studying it. God and science are different kinds of explanation, so they don't compete or conflict. But you see, in order to make them compete and conflict, you have to do what Dawkins does and say they're the same kind of explanation. But that is simply extremely false. And you get this all the time. Lawrence Krauss came out here, I believe, last year, and I've tangled with him several times. And he wrote, the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. Well, that provoked the Irish in me to respond to that. The Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. For what? Well, if I'm giving a lecture on particle physics, The Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. I wouldn't mention God. But if I'm giving a lecture on why there is a universe at all in the first place in which particle physics can be done, then the God is arguably much more important than the Higgs boson. In fact, the Higgs boson is not important at all. It depends on the question you're asking. What we're having here, all the way down so far this evening, are false alternatives. Have you understood that? False alternatives. God or science. Mechanism and law or agency. They're false alternatives. And the atheist limited, or Inc., depends for its continuance on keeping the public completely in a fog about this kind of thing, when actually it's very easy to dispel that fog. Scientific fundamentalism at its extreme insists there's only one level of explanation, and that's the mechanism law explanation. So agents are out. But a little logic will tell you that the existence of a mechanism that does something is not an argument for the non-existence of an agent who designed it. In fact, the more sophisticated the mechanism, the more evidence it is that there is an agent that designed it. So it's confusion, but it leads to another objection, which I better deal with because I'll be asked it anyway and people are interested in it. God cannot be an explanation of anything, says Dawkins. And this is the heart of the God delusion, amazingly. Since you've got to ask, if God created the universe, then who created God? You've heard this argument, haven't you? How many of you have heard this argument? That's interesting, that, because a few years ago, most people hadn't heard it. It had been dismissed as schoolboy confusion. It's now the central argument of an Oxford professor of the public understanding of science. Who created the creator? Who created God? Well, think about it. Let's abstract from it. A bit more logic, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen. This stuff has far more to do with logic than the high reaches of science. Who or what created X? What does that question presuppose? Well, obviously that X is created. So if you ask the question, who created God, you're assuming that God was created, aren't you? Obviously. What if he wasn't? Well, the question doesn't apply. Full stop. That's it. There's nothing more to be said. Oh, yes, there is something more to be said. And I'll say it in a moment. But you see how simply people are bamboozled. They think he's addressing the nature of God, but he's bypassing, of course, the correct nature of God as described in the Bible, the God who always was, the eternal Word. In the beginning, the Word already was. All things came to be through him. And that differentiation at the beginning of John's Gospel is massively important, because it's distinguishing between the eternal that never came to be. The Word never came to be. The universe came to be. How did the universe came to be? Without him, nothing came to be that came to be. So you can apply that to Dawkins if you like. Dawkins claims that God came to be. Well, here's John's Gospel telling you that without him, nothing came to be that came to be. So if God came to be, then God came to be because of God, which is nonsense, of course. So you can argue it from John's Gospel if you like. But since most people don't know anything about John's Gospel, I prefer to argue it just from the simplest of logic. If Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created God's Delusion, I don't think anybody would have read it. Because we all know created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols. So this thing, of course, behind it, philosophically, has behind it the question of ultimate reality. Do the questions go back forever? And the answer is no on both sides, generally speaking. My atheist colleagues, they believe the questions stop with the universe and the multiverse or mass energy. I believe the questions stop with God. So the question is not, is there an ultimate reality? The question is, which reality is ultimate? That's the real question. So, having dismissed this question about God coming to be, we now come to its correlate about the universe. The universe came to be. That is such a fascinating thing for me. Because, you see, I'm old. And I remember the 1960s. None of you will remember the 1960s. Oh, one or two. There we are. Anyway, in the 1960s, I was a student at Cambridge, and there was enormous excitement when evidence began to come in from people like Penzias, Building on Work, and Hubble, and so on, that space-time had a beginning. Now, the thing that's been forgotten is a little bit of ironic history, in that in the UK, this idea met fierce resistance from people at the top of the academy. The editor of Nature, a man called Maddox at the time, wrote, "We cannot go down this road of admitting a beginning to space-time." Why? Because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. Isn't that fascinating? The biggest cosmological discovery of the 20th century was resisted because it converged with what Scripture had been saying for millennia. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I pointed out to some of the leading physicists involved in the Higgs boson discovery, who rather poo-pooed the idea that the Bible had anything intelligible to say. I said, half a minute. 4 centuries. This book has been saying there was a beginning. You didn't believe it. Because if you had believed it, and not Aristotle, you'd have been looking for evidence of a beginning far earlier than you did. You see, you can, ladies and gentlemen, base scientific predictions, not many, but some, on the text of Scripture. And that convergence is staggering, but it has led to a massive problem. I mean, let's think about it. We've seen how easy it is to deal with the question, who created God? God was always there. But now, the scientists have the problem that the universe was not always there. So if there's no God to create it, how does it come to be? And we're back with Leibniz's question. How do you get something from nothing? Do you know, nothing is a fascinating topic. And I'm about to give you a mini lecture on the topic of nothing. So, fasten your seatbelts. You see, when you got something, you can always argue that you can get something for something. Now, the Christian situation is the universe didn't come from nothing. It came by creative fiat from God, who is not nothing and is eternal. But now remove God. So what are you going to do now? Well, you could introduce a multiverse and all this kind of stuff, but I was recently in MIT and Harvard, and I got talking to Alex Vilenkin, one of the world's top cosmologists, and he wrote, and I quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning, multiverse or not, apparently." Now the interest grows. So they've got to get a universe from nothing. Let's listen to one of the major attempts. Hawking and Mlodinow, The Grand Design. The key statement of the book is, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will generate itself from nothing. What? When I read that first, and I was given a preview of the book to write something about it, in the end I wrote a book about it, God and Stephen Hawking, I just was so amazed. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will generate itself from nothing. Contradiction number one, and flat contradiction at that. But it's more interesting. Because there is a law of gravity, he doesn't say because gravity exists. But what on earth would a law of gravity mean if there's no gravity? The laws of nature describe existing things. And behind that is a very curious belief that laws can be creative. It's what caused our financial crisis, by the way. Some people thought that clever mathematics could create money. Do you remember that? It was an absolute disaster. But it is a confusion at the highest levels of science. Does the law of gravity create anything? Of course not. Laws don't even move things. Newton has his famous laws of motion. They never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People with cues do that. Laws don't. And this was illustrated beautifully in a conversation I had with Peter Atkins, who's a famous atheist and a brilliant writer of books on chemistry. I said, Peter, what do you think created the universe? And he said, mathematics. And I hadn't met him before, and I'm afraid I started to laugh. And he said, what are you laughing at? I said, you know, Peter, quite honestly, I'm a mathematician. That's about the silliest thing I've ever heard in my life. He said, what do you mean? Well, I said, 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put $2 in your pocket? Laws don't create anything. Lewis saw it long ago, of course, that you can do mathematics from now to eternity, but they'll never create any money and put it in your pocket. If you've got $1 and $1, they'll give you $2, but you've got to get the dollars first. It's a very simplistic notion that laws are created. But of course, this is much worse than that. The universe can and will create itself. Well, if I say to you, X creates Y, what does that mean? Well, it means assume X and you get Y, essentially. So if I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, it means that if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? It means that nonsense remains nonsense, even if a high-powered scientist is writing it. That's absurd. So here's a book that sets out to solve the problem of getting a universe without a creator. It focuses on nothing and says the universe can create itself because of a law of gravity, which isn't nothing. Where did it come from? And this is the argument for dismissing God. I could scarcely believe it. It's clear that an undergraduate in philosophy never read this book before it was published. Hawking's a brilliant scientist, ladies and gentlemen. I remember him at Cambridge. He was there at the same time as me. And he's light years ahead of me in his mathematical ability. I don't doubt that for a second. But he does fulfill what Einstein once trenchantly said, the scientist is a bad philosopher. And I do get rather passionate about people being misled and their faith in God appearing to be in tatters because of the abuse of scientific authority. I wrote my book for a reason. I had a letter from a young man who was driving his car in the streets of Belfast, and he saw a newspaper hoarding. Hawking says there's no God. And he said, I nearly crashed. I started to tremble. And I thought, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I, little me, to argue against him? Unfortunately, my brother had seen my article in the Times or wherever it was, and he'd Xeroxed it and put it on every seat in his church. And the next day, the lad went into church and he wrote me a very moving letter, and I wrote a book to encourage people like him not to be bamboozled by misused authority. So I do take it seriously because I believe so much is at stake. By all means, let's hear the atheist arguments. I've spent my whole life investigating them. I take them seriously. So it's a very sad situation. So it gets much worse, of course, because you have Lawrence Krauss. Well, Lawrence Krauss has written a book, Getting a Universe from Nothing. Well, if you read this on page 2 or 3, let me see what you'd make of this. Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. That is nonsense. Thrice confounded. How can we possibly take people seriously to do this? Well, you see, ladies and gentlemen, it's showing the desperate lengths to which people have to go to avoid the Creator. That's what it's showing. I'm tempted to say, Paul points out that rejection of the Creator, ignoring the evidence in the natural world, leads to intellectual darkness. And I've noticed some of these writers are getting darker and darker and darker in terms of their logic, which is so far away from anything that makes sense. How can I take that seriously? Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. G.K. Chesterton said this: "It is absurd to complain that it is unthinkable for an unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything." Well, that's about the measure of it. But I have one or two more things that I want to say to bring us to the heart of the modern debate. You see, who created the Creator is part of another kind of argument. And it's a more serious argument. It says, look, God is no explanation for anything, because by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. And of course, we all know that explanation goes from the simple to the complex, so that you can forget God completely. Now, here again, it is a problem about the nature of explanation. I'm going to keep this very brief, and you can ask questions about it if you like. But you see, the interesting thing is this. It has to do with the nature of faith. Faith in science, I mean, not faith in God. The new atheists have been brilliant in redefining faith. They suggest to you that faith is a religious term and it means believing where there's no evidence. That's dangerously, doubly incorrect. Faith is a perfectly normal term, and it means trusting normally on the basis of evidence. Blind faith is what they mean, but they don't call it blind faith, they just call it faith, because they want to obscure the fact that there might just conceivably be evidence for God and for Christianity. But I want to turn the tables by pointing out that faith is essential to science. Not faith in God, but as Einstein pointed out, he couldn't imagine a scientist without that faith. That is faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. You have to believe that science can be done before you do it. That must be obvious. But now comes the fun. Why should I believe it? That science can be done. And I often ask my scientific colleagues, and the conversation goes like this: tell me about what you do science with. And the cute ones say, I do it with my brain. They don't believe that the mind is distinct from the brain. Okay, I say, fine. So tell me about this brain that you do science with. What is it? Give me the short story. I haven't time for the long story. Well, the short story is, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And you trust it. You really trust it. And it causes a little bit of consternation. Darwin suggested there was a difficulty. Did you realize that? Darwin once wrote, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. That statement, known as Darwin's doubt, is now the central focus of this whole debate. You see, as Lewis pointed out in the 1940s, and nobody really listened, we've been thinking about nature, but we've not been thinking about thinking. Because the moment you begin to think about thinking, you realize that there's a vast exception to the reductionism of much of what goes under the name of science. And it's anything that involves language. Richard Dawkins' argument that God is more complex than the thing you're explaining, as I pointed out to him, I pick up a book, it's called The God Delusion. It's reasonably complicated, it's 400 pages. I ask for its origin. It's in the more complex mind of Richard Dawkins, so I dismiss that completely because that's not an explanation, because it's more complex than the thing you're explaining. Nonsense it is. But it's important, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to finish with a little story and then we'll have questions. We started late, so I'm going to tell you a little story. If you'd like a little story, would you like a little story? But it illustrates this brilliantly. Many of you will have heard it before, but that doesn't alter its impact, I think. That in my college at Oxford, we have these nice dinners every Thursday, and we can't choose where we sit. So this night, a man turned out to be a biochemist of world distinction, and he made the mistake of asking me what I did. I said, I'm a pure mathematician. He said, how dreadfully boring. And he meant it. So I backtracked fast and said, well, I know my subject is a bit sociologically and socially inept, so I make up for it by being interested in the big questions. What big questions? Well, I said, like the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Or the status of human life. Is it made in the image of God or not? Oh, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about, and we're going to have a thoroughly miserable dinner. That's a challenge, of course. I said, no, we're not. He said, we're not. I said, not at all. I said, I'm fascinated by reductionism. He said, are you? I said, I know at least 3 sorts, maybe 4. Which sort are you? So I helped him a little bit. And I said, you're a methodological reductionist, aren't you? You split big problems into little problems. You get insight on the little problems. And you hope that that'll help you with big ones. He said, yes, that's what I do. Well, I said, that's what I do. There's a link. Oh, he said, but that's not what I mean. I said, I know it's not what I mean, but at least it's a connection. I said, you are an ontological reductionist, from the Greek word ontos, for being. You think that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. He said, exactly. So I said, let's do an experiment. He said, what? At the dinner table? I said, of course, this is Oxford. So I picked up the menu, and on it, it said roast chicken, R-O-A-S-T. He said, it says roast chicken. What's the problem? I said, none at all. How do you know it says roast chicken? Well, he said to me, look, R-O-A-S-T, that is roast. I said, how do you know? I said, you're a reductionist? Yes. Well, I said, these marks on paper, R-O-A-S-T, as we call them. I said, you're a reductionist? Yes. Everything explained in terms of physics and chemistry? Yes. Okay, I said, you explain to me the semiotics of those letters, the way they carry meaning, in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife was beside him. And rather too loudly, she said, get out of that if he can. He didn't try. He said something that stunned me, and it's happened several times since. He said, it can't be done. He said, I have gone into my laboratory in Oxford for 40 years thinking it could be done. And he said, it so obviously can't. The nature of those marks demands an intelligent input at some level. I nearly said to him, what, an intelligence of the gaps? But of course it isn't. Because intelligence is the only thing within our experience that accounts for those marks having a semiotic dimension. It's not an intelligence of the gaps. It's that the very nature of what has to be explained demands an informational input. And then comes the twist, because he studied DNA. Roast is 5 letters long. DNA is 3.5 billion letters long. In a chemical alphabet, codons, they call them codons because they code for something. What's the origin of that? Oh, chance and the laws of nature. Really? I wonder what's going on, ladies and gentlemen. I know what's going on. They look at ROAST and instantly postulate intelligence because it's the semiotic nature of the marks. They look at DNA and they daren't postulate intelligence because it raises the God question instantly. Now, many people tell me the Bible is a primitive book. I ask them, how is it then that in the very limited amount of space it devotes to creation, it hits the central nail on the head? In the beginning was the Word, and God said, and God said, and God said. That's talking about information, and we've lived to the information age, and we know that information is crucial to the understanding of biology. But now what we know is that information isn't material, it's immaterial. That's the end of materialism, of course, as a philosophy, directly out of science. And that fascinates me. So let me conclude on Darwin's doubt. You see, serious atheists are now saying it's a problem. Thomas Nagel wrote a devastating book. If you want to see its effect, Google it. It's called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. Why? Because, I quote, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. That's an atheist writing, one of the most brilliant philosophers on the planet. And ladies and gentlemen, let me close by saying my major reason for rejecting atheism is not because I'm a Christian. It's because I'm a scientist. Because you see, my science depends on this being a rationally intelligible universe. It depends on me being a text producer and also a text reader. There's a textual nature to this universe. And therefore, I think that atheism with its reductionism doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot. That's painful. It shoots itself in the brain, and that's fatal. Thank you very much.